Dr. Samuel Hartwell arrived at the Chesapeake Medical College on a Tuesday morning in April 1847, expecting nothing more unusual than the spring fever cases that had been flooding the clinic. What he found instead, waiting in a basket lined with threadbare cotton, would haunt him until his death 3 decades later. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old. A slave child, brought in by the overseer of the Talbot estate just outside Baltimore. The baby was healthy by all measures, pink gums, steady breathing, a strong grip when Hartwell offered his finger. But when the child opened its eyes, the doctor felt something cold settle in his chest. They were not simply similar to another child's eyes. They were identical. Precisely, impossibly identical to the eyes of another infant he'd examined 3 months prior at the Annapolis dispensary. The same unusual amber color, yes, but also the same minute flecks of gold arranged in the exact same pattern around the pupils. The same thin, darker ring at the outer edge of each iris. The same slightly elongated shape to the left eye. Hartwell had been practicing medicine for 17 years. He'd examined hundreds of children. He knew the range of human variation. This was beyond variation. This was replication. He asked the overseer if the mother had been moved from another plantation recently. The man said no, she'd been born on Talbot land herself. Never traveled more than 5 miles in her life. Hartwell asked about the father. The overseer's face hardened, and he said nothing useful. Hartwell pressed, mentioning he'd seen another child with remarkably similar eyes. The overseer left quickly after that, taking the baby with him, saying Dr. Hartwell's services wouldn't be needed after all. That night, Hartwell pulled out his medical journal and found his notes from January. The first infant, a girl, brought in by a midwife from a plantation in Anne Arundel County. He'd made detailed sketches of the unusual eye coloration, noted the patterns. He laid the drawings beside his fresh sketches from that morning. They matched perfectly. 2 babies born on plantations 40 miles apart to mothers who'd never met, somehow possessed the same eyes down to the smallest detail. And if Dr. Hartwell had learned anything in his years practicing medicine in the slaveholding regions of Maryland, it was this. When something impossible kept appearing among the enslaved population, there was always a human explanation. And it was rarely innocent. If you've ever wondered what secrets were kept in the medical records of the antebellum South, the kinds of patterns that doctors noticed but dared not speak aloud, then stay with this story. Because what Dr. Hartwell discovered in the months that followed would force him to choose between his medical ethics and his physical safety. And the choice he made would mean some truths stayed buried for more than a generation. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you find this story compelling, if you want to hear more histories that have been deliberately obscured, then subscribe to this channel right now. These stories take weeks of research to uncover, and your subscription tells me you value this work. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps ensure I can keep bringing you these forgotten chapters of American history. Now back to Maryland, 1847, where Dr. Hartwell was about to realize the pattern was far larger than 2 babies. Dr. Hartwell couldn't let it rest. His medical training had instilled in him a compulsion toward understanding, toward finding the mechanism beneath the mystery. That same week, he began writing to colleagues across Maryland, doctors who served plantation populations, who might have encountered similar cases. Most never replied. 2 wrote back with curt notes saying they had no relevant observations, but Dr. Marcus Finley, who ran a small practice in Dorchester County, sent a different kind of letter. Finley had seen it too, not just once, but twice, both times in the past year, both times involving infants born to enslaved women. Both times those distinctive amber eyes with the gold flecks in the identical pattern. Finley had assumed it was some kind of hereditary trait until Hartwell's letter arrived, because his 2 cases were from plantations owned by different families, with no known connection between the mothers. The 2 doctors met in May at a medical society gathering in Baltimore. They found a quiet corner in the meeting hall and compared their notes. 4 children total now, 4 plantations. Talbot, Annapolis, Dorchester, two separate estates in Dorchester. No familial connection between the mothers, no shared ancestry that anyone knew of. Hartwell asked the obvious question, could it be the fathers? Finley had already considered this. If one man was traveling between these plantations, fathering children with enslaved women, we might expect to see familial resemblance. But this isn't resemblance. You've seen it yourself. These eyes are reproductions. Hartwell suggested they might be dealing with some unknown medical phenomenon, perhaps a rare condition triggered by environmental factors, something in the water or soil particular to Maryland's tidewater region. Finley looked around to make sure no one was listening. Or perhaps, he said quietly, someone is conducting an experiment. The idea seemed absurd at first. But this was Maryland in 1847, just 18 years before the end of slavery. Medical experimentation on enslaved people was not unknown. Dr. J. Marion Sims, down in Alabama, was already conducting his gynecological surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia. Dr. Thomas Hamilton in Georgia had been testing heat endurance by placing enslaved men in heated pits. The medical journals occasionally published studies that relied on clinical material that could only have been obtained through enslaved subjects. But eye color? What possible medical knowledge could be gained from attempting to create children with identical eye patterns? Hartwell and Finley decided to expand their inquiry. Over the next 3 months, they contacted every doctor they knew who practiced in Maryland's plantation regions. They were careful in their wording, asking only if colleagues had encountered unusual cases of distinctive ocular characteristics in Negro infants. By August, they had 13 confirmed cases. 13 babies born between November 1846 and July 1847, all with the same impossible eyes. The plantations were scattered across 6 counties: Talbot, Anne Arundel, Dorchester, Queen Anne's, Kent, and Caroline. Some were large tobacco estates. Some were smaller farms. Some plantation owners were wealthy and politically connected. Others were struggling to maintain profitability in Maryland's declining agricultural economy. The only pattern Hartwell and Finley could identify was this. All 13 plantations had purchased slaves within the previous 2 years, and all those purchases had been made through the same Baltimore auction house, Chandler & Sons, located on Pratt Street. Chandler & Sons had operated in Baltimore since 1819. It was one of the largest slave trading firms in Maryland, second only to the notorious Franklin and Armfield operation that shipped thousands of enslaved people to the Deep South. But unlike Franklin and Armfield, Chandler & Sons dealt primarily in local sales, supplying Maryland planters with field hands, house servants, and skilled laborers. The auction house occupied a 3-story brick building with holding cells in the basement and showrooms on the upper floors. Thomas Chandler, the founder, had died in 1842, leaving the business to his 2 sons, William and Robert. By all accounts, they ran a respectable operation, if such a word could apply to the business of selling human beings. Hartwell visited the auction house in late August, posing as a potential buyer, interested in acquiring a house servant. He was shown to a waiting room decorated with mahogany furniture and oil paintings of Maryland landscapes, a deliberate attempt to give the place an air of genteel commerce. A clerk eventually brought out a ledger and began describing available stock. Hartwell made some non-committal inquiries, then casually asked if the firm had any breeding women for sale. The clerk's demeanor shifted slightly. He said Chandler & Sons didn't specialize in that particular market, but could make arrangements if the buyer was serious. Hartwell pressed further, mentioning he'd heard that some Maryland planters were quite successful with their breeding programs, producing healthy children with remarkable consistency. Had Chandler & Sons facilitated any such programs? The clerk closed the ledger. He said very politely that Chandler & Sons maintained strict confidentiality regarding their clients' intentions. He suggested that Dr. Hartwell visit another establishment if his interests ran in that direction. The conversation was over. Hartwell left empty-handed but more convinced than ever that Chandler & Sons was the connection point. That evening he met again with Dr. Finley. They reviewed what they knew: 13 infants with identical eyes. 13 plantations that had recently purchased slaves through Chandler and Sons. The purchases had occurred between 1845 and early 1847, roughly 9 to 11 months before the births of the distinctive-eyed children. "They're not selling breeding women," Finley said. "They're selling stud males, men selected or bred specifically to produce children with those eyes." But why? That was the question that neither doctor could answer. What possible advantage would there be in creating children with matching eye patterns? It wasn't a desirable trait that would make the children more valuable as laborers. It wasn't a beauty standard that would increase their worth as house servants. If anything, it was a liability, a distinctive mark that made the children easily identifiable, potentially easier to track if they escaped. Unless that was the point. Hartwell felt sick as the realization formed. "Identification," he said. "They're marking them, like branding cattle, but biological. Permanent." Finley stared at him. "Good God. But marking them as what? Property of Chandler and Sons? Or property of whoever commissioned this project? William, if someone wanted to track the offspring of certain enslaved men to maintain records of bloodlines for some purpose, this would be an effective method, far more subtle than physical brands. What purpose could possibly require that level of tracking?" Hartwell had no answer, but he knew someone who might. Dr. Lawrence Keating, the chief medical officer at the Chesapeake Medical College. Keating had been practicing in Maryland for nearly 40 years. He'd trained some of the state's most prominent physicians. If anyone had heard rumors about unusual breeding programs or medical experiments involving enslaved populations, it would be Keating. Dr. Keating received Hartwell in his office on a September evening, after the day's teaching was complete. The old professor listened carefully as Hartwell laid out the evidence: the 13 infants, the identical eyes, the connection to Chandler and Sons, the theory about biological marking. When Hartwell finished, Keating was quiet for a long time. Then he rose, went to his door, checked that the hallway was empty, and closed the door firmly. "You need to stop this investigation immediately," Keating said. Hartwell was stunned. "Sir, if there's a systematic program of experimentation occurring—" "Of course there is," Keating interrupted. "Do you think you're the first to notice patterns among the enslaved population? Do you think other doctors haven't seen things that disturbed them? The question is not whether such things occur. The question is whether you want to survive pointing them out." Keating returned to his desk and removed a file from a locked drawer. 3 years ago, a doctor in Virginia named Samuel Cartwright published a paper identifying what he called drapetomania, a supposed mental illness that caused slaves to run away. He claimed it could be prevented through proper management and, if necessary, medical intervention. The paper was absurd, scientifically bankrupt, an insult to medicine. But it was published in a major journal, and Cartwright received appointments and honors for his work. "I don't understand what—" "The point, Samuel, is that the medical establishment in the South is deeply invested in maintaining certain fictions about the enslaved population, and certain truths are not permitted to surface. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Hartwell felt anger rising. "That we should ignore evidence of human experimentation because it's politically inconvenient? I'm telling you that doctors who ask too many questions about what happens on plantations have a tendency to lose their practices. Or worse." Keating opened the file. Dr. Edmund Foster in South Carolina published a paper in 1839 questioning the ethics of medical testing on enslaved subjects. His clinic was burned down 6 months later, never practiced again. Dr. Nathan Price in Georgia testified at a trial that injuries to an enslaved child were inconsistent with an accident, implying abuse. He was found beaten half to death in an alley 2 weeks later, survived but left the state. Dr. James Whitfield, right here in Maryland, Dorchester County, started asking questions about mortality rates among enslaved children on certain estates. His medical license was revoked on trumped-up charges of incompetence. Died in poverty. Keating closed the file. "The institution of slavery is sustained by agreement, Samuel," spoken and unspoken. One of those agreements is that certain things are not examined too closely. Whatever is happening with these children, whoever is behind it has resources and connections. If you continue pursuing this, you will lose everything, and you won't save a single child. Hartwell wanted to argue, but he knew Keating was right. He was a single doctor with no political connections, no wealth, no protection. He was exactly the kind of person who could disappear into the category of unfortunate accidents. But the scientific part of his mind still needed to understand. Can you at least tell me if you've heard anything? Rumors about what might be happening? Keating sighed. There are always rumors. About breeding programs designed to produce stronger laborers. About medical studies tracking heredity and racial characteristics. About wealthy men funding research into human reproduction. Some plantation owners fancy themselves natural philosophers, conducting experiments in selective breeding the way English lords breed hunting dogs. But it's all rumors, Samuel. Nothing that could be proven in court. Nothing that would matter, even if it could be. And the eyes? Have you heard anything specific about attempts to manipulate eye color? Keating hesitated. There's a doctor, practices in Baltimore, but quietly, not affiliated with any hospital or college. Name is Theodore Cross. Educated in Europe, Germany, I believe. Came to Maryland about 6 years ago. Specializes in women's health, obstetrics. Very private practice, very wealthy clients. Word is, he has particular theories about heredity and racial characteristics. You think he's involved? I think he's the kind of man who might have the knowledge and the lack of ethics necessary for such a project. And I think that's all you should know. Keating stood, signaling the conversation was over. Go home, Samuel. Destroy your notes about this. Focus on your regular practice. Forget about the babies with identical eyes. That's my professional advice and my personal plea. Forget it before someone makes you forget everything permanently. But Dr. Hartwell couldn't forget. The scientific mystery had become something deeper, a moral imperative. These were children being marked like property, subjected to some unknown manipulation before they were even born. And everyone in power seemed willing to look away. He couldn't investigate Chandler & Sons further without drawing attention. He couldn't approach Dr. Theodore Cross without risking exposure. But there was one avenue that Keating hadn't mentioned, one network that existed parallel to the official structures of white Southern society, the enslaved people themselves. Hartwell had a patient named Grace, a free black woman who ran a boarding house on Lexington Street. Grace had been manumitted 15 years earlier by her former owner and had built a successful business serving Baltimore's free black community. She was also, Hartwell had learned over years of casual conversation, deeply connected to the underground network that helped enslaved people escape north. He visited her on a Sunday afternoon when the boarding house was quiet. Grace served him tea in her small parlor, and Hartwell explained what he'd discovered, carefully, vaguely, leaving out names and specific details. When he finished, Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The babies with the special eyes. We know about them." Hartwell's heart jumped. "You've heard about this? Dr. Hartwell, we hear about everything that happens to our people. Every auction, every family separation, every child born or sold or lost. The mothers talk. The word spreads. We've known about the eye babies for near a year now. What do you call them? Eye babies? Marked children is what most say. Some of the older folks call them crossroad babies, but that's more superstition than truth." Grace refilled his tea. "You want to know what's happening? I can tell you what we know, but it won't make sense to you. It barely makes sense to us." She explained. Starting in late 1845, Chandler & Sons had begun purchasing enslaved men from Virginia and North Carolina, young men, healthy, strong. These men were never put up for general sale. Instead, they were held at the auction house for weeks or months, then quietly transferred to specific plantations under private arrangements. The men were called specialty stock in the Chandler ledgers. They were never sold permanently, only leased for periods of 6 months to a year. And they were always returned to Chandler & Sons when the lease ended. Returned? Hartwell asked. You mean brought back to Baltimore? Brought back, and then disappeared. They don't leave on ships, they don't go to other plantations, they vanish from the record. Grace had gotten this information from a woman named Delia, who'd been a cook at Chandler & Sons until 3 months ago. Delia had been responsible for feeding the specialty stock during their stays at the auction house. She said the men were kept separate from other enslaved people, housed in a special section of the holding cells. They received better food than typical stock. They were examined regularly by a doctor, not a regular physician, but someone who came at night, who Delia never saw clearly. And all the men, Delia reported, had the same distinctive eyes, amber-colored, with gold flecks in unusual patterns. Hartwell felt dizzy. They're breeding them, creating a line of men with those eyes, then leasing them out to plantations to father children. But why? What's the end goal? Grace shook her head. That's what we can't figure. At first, some folks thought maybe it was about making slaves easier to identify, harder to escape. But that don't make sense. Why would plantation owners pay extra to breed identifiable slaves? That's bad for the owner's investment. Could it be about tracking bloodlines? Scientific research into heredity? Could be. White doctors have always been curious about mixing bloodlines, trying to prove their theories about race. But usually that research is done with measurements and charts, not by breeding specific children. Hartwell thought about Dr. Theodore Cross, the mysterious physician with theories about heredity. The doctor who examines the men at Chandler & Sons. Has anyone gotten a description? Tall, white hair, though not an old man. Speaks with a slight accent, maybe European. Very particular about the men's health, that's all Delia could say. It matched Cross, but Hartwell still didn't have proof, didn't have a plan. What could he do with this information? Write a paper that would never be published, report it to authorities who wouldn't care. Keating was right. He had no power to stop this, whatever it was. But Grace had thought of something he hadn't. The children, she said, the marked children. They're still babies now, but they'll grow. In 5 years, 10 years, they'll be old enough to work, old enough to be sold. If this is about tracking them, whatever it's tracking will become clear when they mature. You want me to wait a decade to understand what's happening? I'm saying that time will tell. And in the meantime, we do what we can. Some of those children, we can get them out. The Underground Railroad, get them north before whatever's planned for them happens. Hartwell hadn't considered this. You're talking about helping specific children escape? I'm saying that if I knew which children were marked, which plantations they were on, I could make sure the network knows. Make those children a priority. It won't save all of them, but it might save some. I want to pause here for a moment. If this story is troubling you, if you're feeling the weight of what these people faced, leave a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking. These stories work best when we don't experience them alone, when we acknowledge together how dark this history was. And while you're at it, hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Stories that don't flinch from difficult truths. Now, back to 1847, where Dr. Hartwell was about to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. Over the next 2 months, Hartwell did something he never thought he would do. He became a criminal. Not in his own mind. In his mind, he was upholding a higher law, the physician's duty to prevent harm. But in the eyes of Maryland law, he was engaged in theft and conspiracy. He used his position as a doctor to gain access to plantation records. When called to examine enslaved children, he made careful note of which ones bore the distinctive eyes. He passed this information to Grace, who passed it through the network. And slowly, deliberately, some of those children began to disappear. Not all of them. The network could only handle so much traffic, could only take so much risk. But by the end of 1847, 4 of the marked children had made it north, smuggled out in the middle of the night, hidden in false-bottomed wagons, passed from safe house to safe house until they crossed into Pennsylvania. Hartwell told himself he was doing the right thing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was treating symptoms rather than disease. that the real problem was still operating unchecked. Then, in January 1848, Dr. Marcus Finley disappeared. Finley had been the other doctor investigating the Marked children, the one who'd first confirmed Hartwell's observations. They'd stayed in touch through the autumn, though Hartwell had tried to convince Finley to drop the investigation after his conversation with Dr. Keating. Finley had refused, said he was close to finding solid proof of what was happening. The last letter Hartwell received from Finley was dated January 8, 1848. It was brief and cryptic. Samuel, I've located patient records from Cross. Meeting someone tomorrow who has access to his private files. This is bigger than we thought. We'll write with full details once I've seen the documents. M.F. There were no further letters. Hartwell sent 3 inquiries to Finley's office in Dorchester County, received no response. Finally, in late January, he traveled to Dorchester himself. Finley's clinic was closed, the building empty. Neighbors said Dr. Finley had left town suddenly, something about a family emergency in Philadelphia. But when Hartwell checked with the Medical Society in Philadelphia, no one had heard from Finley. No family emergency had been reported. Dr. Marcus Finley had simply ceased to exist. Hartwell knew what that meant. Someone had gotten to Finley. Either he'd been killed, or he'd been frightened into silence and flight. And whoever was responsible now knew that multiple doctors were investigating the Marked children. Hartwell waited for the knock on his own door, for the threatening letter, for the violence that had silenced Finley. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing happened. His practice continued normally. No one questioned him. No one threatened him. He realized why in March, when he saw Grace again. She told him the underground network had heard word. Dr. Finley had gotten too close, started asking questions directly of people connected to Chandler and Sons. He'd been warned, ignored the warning, and been forcibly removed. But Hartwell was being left alone because he'd been more careful, because his inquiries had been more discreet. They don't want a pattern of dead doctors, Grace explained. 1 disappearance is unfortunate. 2 is a conspiracy. As long as you stay quiet, as long as you don't push too publicly, they'll leave you be. It was a threat disguised as mercy. Shut up, or join Finley. Hartwell shut up. He stopped his investigation. He destroyed his notes, exactly as Dr. Keating had advised. He continued helping Marked children escape when he could, but he stopped asking questions about the broader program. And for 2 years, that was enough. The Marked children kept being born. Grace's network estimated at least 30 by the end of 1849, but Hartwell focused on what he could control, which was saving individual lives rather than exposing systemic evil. Then he met Judith. Judith arrived at Hartwell's clinic on a May evening in 1850, brought by Grace. She was a young woman, maybe 22, with a deep scar across her left forearm and eyes that had seen too much. She was also 8 months pregnant. "This is the one I told you about," Grace said quietly. "She has something you need to hear." Judith had been enslaved on a plantation in Queen Anne's County, one of the estates that had leased specialty stock from Chandler and Sons. The man had been named Peter, tall, strong, with those distinctive amber eyes. He'd been brought to the plantation in March 1849 with explicit instructions from the owner. Peter was to be matched with Judith. "Matched?" Hartwell asked, though he knew what it meant. "Forced together," Judith said flatly. "Not asked. Told. The master said Peter was valuable stock. Said I should be grateful to bear his child. Said the baby would be special." She'd gotten pregnant quickly. Peter had remained on the plantation for 3 months, then was taken back to Baltimore. Judith never saw him again. But she heard things. From other enslaved people, from house servants who overheard conversations, from the whisper network that carried information across counties. Peter, she learned, had fathered at least 6 other children on different plantations over the previous 2 years. All the mothers had been young, healthy, and light-skinned. All the children had been born with the same distinctive eyes. "But there's more," Judith said. "The children don't stay with their mothers. Soon as they're weaned, they're taken. Sold, the masters say, but not at regular auctions. They go somewhere specific." Hartwell's blood went cold. Where? I don't know exactly, but I heard the overseer talking once. He was drunk, bragging to another white man about how much money he'd made from the special babies. Said there was a school, a place where they raised children for particular purposes. Said it was an experiment, something about proving theories about racial mixing and intelligence. A school. An experimental facility raising children bred for specific characteristics. The pieces were starting to form a terrible picture. Hartwell asked if Judith knew where this school was located. She didn't, but said the overseer had mentioned Western Maryland, somewhere in the mountains, isolated. Why are you telling me this? Hartwell asked. Why trust me? Judith met his eyes. Because Grace says you're helping children escape. And I want my baby out before they come to take her. I can feel it's a girl, and I won't let them have her for their experiments, Grace explained. Judith had been granted permission to visit Baltimore to see a midwife, a common practice for complicated pregnancies. But instead of returning to Queen Anne's County, Judith was going to be reported as having run away. The underground network would move her north, get her to Canada before the baby was born. But I need you to know about the school, Judith said. Need someone to know what's happening. Because there are children there already, maybe a dozen or more. Children who don't have mothers fighting for them, children who've been property since birth. Somebody needs to know they exist. Hartwell promised he would find a way to use the information. He examined Judith, confirmed she was healthy enough for the dangerous journey north. A week later she was gone, smuggled out of Maryland on a route Hartwell deliberately didn't learn. But the information about the school consumed him. An experimental facility in Western Maryland. Children raised for particular purposes. Theories about racial mixing and intelligence. It echoed the worst elements of the scientific racism that was gaining popularity in the 1850s. Scholars like Samuel Morton and Josiah Knott were publishing works arguing for innate racial hierarchies, claiming that black people were biologically inferior to whites. Others argued that children of mixed race would be weak or sterile, or conversely, that careful breeding could create a perfect laboring class, combining the supposed intelligence of whites with the supposed physical endurance of blacks. What if someone was trying to prove these theories through direct experimentation? Creating children with specific genetic markers, raising them in controlled conditions, studying their development and capabilities? The marked eyes weren't about identification for the market. They were about identification for research, a way to track which children were part of the experimental group to distinguish them from random enslaved children. Hartwell needed to find the school. But Western Maryland was vast. Thousands of square miles of mountains and valleys, isolated farms and small communities. He couldn't simply wander the countryside asking about secret experimental facilities. He needed someone who knew the region, someone with connections to enslaved populations in that area. He needed the underground network's help, but Grace was already taking enormous risks. Asking her to investigate a facility likely guarded and violent might be too much. While Hartwell wrestled with this, events beyond his control were reshaping the nation. The Fugitive Slave Act passed Congress in September 1850, dramatically increasing the federal government's role in capturing and returning escaped slaves. The law made Hartwell's work with the underground network far more dangerous. It also made powerful people more paranoid about losing their human property. And paranoid people, Hartwell learned, made mistakes. The mistake came in the form of a ledger stolen by a boy named Thomas. Thomas was 16, enslaved at Chandler & Sons, where he worked as a general assistant, cleaning, moving inventory, running errands. He was also memorizing everything he saw and passing information to the underground network through a complex series of intermediaries. In November 1850, Thomas managed to sneak into the private office of William Chandler during a late-night cleaning shift. He found a locked cabinet, forced it open with a pry bar, and discovered several ledgers inside. He couldn't take them. Their absence would be noticed immediately. But he spent 3 hours reading by candlelight, memorizing what he could. The information Thomas brought to the network, and which Grace eventually shared with Hartwell, was devastating in its clarity. The specialty stock program had been operating since 1844, not 1845, as Hartwell had thought. In 6 years, it had produced 47 children with the marked eyes. The program was overseen by Dr. Theodore Cross, funded by a consortium of 4 wealthy Maryland families, and aimed at what the ledger called hereditary optimization research. The children were indeed being collected at a facility in Allegheny County, western Maryland, near the town of Frostburg. The facility was officially registered as Cross Haven Academy, described in public documents as a charitable school for orphaned mulatto children. But the ledger made clear its real purpose: studying the marked children's development, testing theories about inherited intelligence and physical capacity, and ultimately demonstrating that selective breeding could create a superior class of enslaved laborers. The men being bred, the ones with the distinctive eyes, were themselves products of earlier breeding experiments. Dr. Cross had started the project in North Carolina in the late 1830s, deliberately creating children with unusual eye characteristics by selectively pairing enslaved people over multiple generations. The goal had been to establish a visible marker that bred true, that would reliably appear in offspring. Once he'd succeeded, Cross had moved to Maryland to expand the program. Most chilling, the ledger described what would happen to the marked children once they reached adolescence. They would be evaluated for characteristics deemed valuable: intelligence, strength, obedience, temperament. Those who scored highly would be bred again, continuing the line. Those who didn't would be sold south, removed from the program. It was industrial breeding applied to human beings, and it had been operating for over a decade without any public scrutiny. I need to interrupt for just a moment. If you know someone who should hear this story, someone who thinks they understand American history but might not know how deep this goes, share this video with them. Use the share button below. Send it directly. Post it where it needs to be seen. This is the kind of history that changes how we understand the present. Now, back to Maryland, 1850, where Dr. Hartwell finally had evidence and no safe way to use it. Hartwell now had information that could expose the entire operation. He had testimony from Judith about the school. He had the ledger details from Thomas. He could, theoretically, write an exposé, send it to newspapers, force a public reckoning. But he knew exactly what would happen if he did. The story would be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. The families funding the research were wealthy and connected. They would deny everything, claim the accusations were lies meant to undermine the Southern way of life. Chandler and Sons would close briefly, then reopen under a new name. Dr. Cross would relocate, continue his research elsewhere, and Hartwell would be destroyed. His medical license revoked, his reputation ruined, possibly his life ended. The fate that befell Dr. Finley would become his own. But there was another option, one that Grace proposed: destroy the research directly. Not exposure, she explained. Elimination. We get those children out of Cross Haven, we burn the records, we make it so the program can't continue. It would require coordination across the entire Maryland network. Scouts would need to infiltrate Cross Haven, map the facility, identify where children were housed and where records were kept. A large-scale escape would need to be planned, getting nearly 50 children out of western Maryland and to freedom. And the facility itself would need to be damaged badly enough that Cross couldn't simply rebuild. It was dangerous, borderline impossible. But it was also the only plan that might actually save the children. Hartwell agreed to help in the only way he could, providing medical support for the operation. He would travel to western Maryland, ostensibly as a doctor offering services to the rural population, but actually scouting Cross Haven and preparing to treat injured escapees if the operation went badly. In January 1851, Hartwell closed his Baltimore practice temporarily, citing a need for rest and travel. He journeyed west into the Allegheny Mountains to Frostburg, a small coal mining town near the Pennsylvania border. Crosshaven Academy sat 3 miles outside town, at the end of a long dirt road. It was a large stone building, 2 stories, surrounded by a fence. From a distance it looked like any boarding school. Windows with curtains, a bell tower, a yard where children played during supervised hours. Hartwell posed as a traveling physician and made inquiries in Frostburg. The townspeople knew about Crosshaven, spoke of it as a charitable endeavor, a place where orphaned, colored children received education and vocational training. Dr. Cross, they said, was a generous man, a visionary who believed in the uplift of the colored race through proper guidance. No one seemed to know or admit that the children were all experiments, bred for research purposes, marked with identical eyes. Hartwell managed to visit Crosshaven once, claiming he wanted to offer his medical services to the school. He was received politely by an administrator named Mrs. Fletcher, who gave him a carefully controlled tour. He saw children in classrooms, learning basic literacy and arithmetic. He saw others in a workshop, practicing carpentry and sewing. Everyone looked healthy, well-fed, adequately clothed, but he also noticed things that troubled him. The children never spoke unless spoken to, moved in rigid lines, showed none of the natural energy and chaos of normal childhood. And when he looked closely at their eyes, amber with gold flecks, all identical, he saw something that chilled him. They looked at him with perfect blankness, as if they'd learned that showing emotion was dangerous. Mrs. Fletcher declined his offer of medical services, saying Crosshaven had an excellent resident physician. Hartwell was shown out. He'd learned the layout, confirmed the children were there, but hadn't found where records were kept or how heavily the place was guarded. The network would need more information. Over the next month, 3 black operatives, 2 men and 1 woman, all free blacks from Pennsylvania, visited Frostburg, posing as laborers looking for work. They observed Crosshaven's routines, bribed a supply driver for information about the building's interior, and identified the best approach routes. By March, they had a plan. But before they could execute it, something happened that changed everything. Dr. Theodore Cross died. Cross's death was sudden, a heart seizure according to the death notice in the Baltimore Sun. He was 53 years old, had been in apparent good health, and left no family. His private papers and research materials, the notice stated, had been donated to the Chesapeake Medical College for the advancement of medical science. Hartwell saw the notice and felt a cold certainty. The papers would disappear. The families funding the research wouldn't allow Cross's work to become public. Whatever had been donated would be quietly destroyed or hidden, unless Hartwell could get to them first. Dr. Keating, the medical college's chief officer, received Hartwell in his office with obvious reluctance. Yes, Cross's papers had arrived, 3 large crates. No, they hadn't been catalogued yet. No, Hartwell could not examine them. They were the property of the college, and besides, they'd been designated for restricted access. Restricted by whom? Hartwell demanded. By the gentlemen who are funding a new research wing in Cross's honor. They've made a generous donation to ensure his work continues in appropriate hands. The consortium. They were buying the college's cooperation, ensuring Cross's research remained controlled and secret. Hartwell left Keating's office furious and helpless. But that evening, he received an unexpected visitor. Thomas, the young man who'd stolen the ledger information from Chandler and Sons. Thomas had escaped. After providing the ledger details to the network, his position had become too dangerous. He'd been smuggled north in December and was now legally free in Pennsylvania. But he'd come back to Maryland for a specific purpose. I heard about Dr. Cross dying, Thomas said. Heard about his papers going to the medical college. I know where they're keeping those crates. Thomas had worked at the college 2 years prior, doing maintenance. He knew the building's layout, knew that restricted materials were stored in a locked basement archive room. And he knew how to get in. You want to steal them, Hartwell said. I want to expose them. Papers like that, they need to see daylight, but I can't read well enough to know what's important. You can, so we go together. It was insane. Hartwell would be caught, arrested, jailed. His medical career would end in disgrace. But he thought about the children at Cross Haven, about the decades of experimentation, about Dr. Finley's disappearance and Judith's scarred arm, and the 47 babies marked like livestock. "When?" he asked. "Tonight. College is empty on Saturday nights, just one watchman, and I know his route." They went at midnight. Thomas picked the lock on a rear entrance. Hartwell followed him through dark hallways to the basement archive. Thomas picked another lock. He was disturbingly skilled at this, and they were in. 3 crates exactly as Keating had described. Hartwell and Thomas worked by the light of a shuttered lantern, pulling out files and documents, looking for anything that explained the full scope of Cross's work. Most of it was scientific: breeding charts, heredity tables, measurements, and observations about the marked children's development. But deeper in the second crate, Hartwell found something else. Correspondence. Letters between Cross and the 4 families funding his research. Letters discussing the program's goals, its challenges, its successes. And in those letters, the truth emerged with horrible clarity. The marked children weren't being bred to become superior slaves. They were being bred to become proof that such breeding was possible. Living evidence that could be used to justify the expansion of slavery. The families funding Cross weren't plantation owners. They were investors and politicians, men with stakes in slavery's continuation as an institution. And they understood that by the 1850s, slavery was under moral and economic pressure. Abolitionism was growing. Some southern states were considering gradual emancipation. The system needed new justification. Cross's research was meant to provide that justification. If he could demonstrate that selective breeding improved enslaved populations, made them healthier and more capable, it would support arguments that slavery was actually beneficial, a form of managed improvement that elevated black people beyond what they could achieve in freedom. The marked children were meant to be exhibited, studied, used as propaganda. One letter, dated 1849, was particularly explicit. It came from a Maryland state legislator named Howard Prescott and outlined a plan to present Cross's research to the state assembly, arguing for legislation that would encourage scientific improvement of the colored population through regulated breeding programs. Prescott believed this could become a model for other slave states, a way to frame slavery as progressive rather than barbaric. The program had never been about the individual children. They were meant to be tools in a political argument, living props in a defense of human bondage. Hartwell felt sick. He gathered as many of the most damaging letters as he could carry, stuffed them in a leather satchel. Thomas took photographs and breeding charts, anything that documented the scale of the operation. They were nearly finished when they heard footsteps above. The night watchman off his usual route. Thomas motioned for silence. They shuttered the lantern and waited in darkness. The footsteps came closer, reached the top of the basement stairs, paused. Hartwell's heart hammered. Then the footsteps retreated, moved away down the hall. After 10 minutes of frozen silence, Thomas whispered that they should leave immediately. They got out the same way they'd entered, disappeared into Baltimore's night streets with their stolen evidence. By morning, Hartwell was back in his rented room, reading through the documents more carefully, trying to decide what to do with them. The letters alone could cause a scandal. Published in the right newspapers, sent to abolitionist organizations in the North, they might spark outrage sufficient to shut down Cross Haven and discredit the families involved. But they might also galvanize pro-slavery forces, make Cross's research a rallying point rather than an embarrassment. Hartwell realized he needed advice, needed someone with political connections and moral courage. He needed to contact the abolitionist movement directly. Through Grace's network, he arranged to meet with William Watkins, a prominent black abolitionist in Baltimore. Watkins examined the documents and immediately understood their significance. "This is what we've been saying all along," Watkins said. "That slavery corrupts absolutely. That it turns human beings into experimental subjects, children into property, science into propaganda. These letters prove it. Can you use them? Publish them? I can get them to Frederick Douglass. He'll know what to do." "But Samuel," You understand what will happen to you if your involvement becomes known? I understand. Watkins studied him. Why are you doing this? You're a white man, a doctor, respected. You could walk away, protect yourself. Why risk everything? Hartwell thought about the babies he'd examined, about their identical eyes staring up at him with infant innocence, unaware they'd been marked for experimentation before birth. Because someone has to, he said, and I was in a position to know. The documents reached Frederick Douglass in April 1851. Douglass was, by that time, one of America's most famous abolitionists, a formerly enslaved man whose writings and speeches had made him a national figure. He understood immediately how to deploy the stolen evidence. Rather than publish the documents directly, which would allow Cross's defenders to claim forgery or distortion, Douglass used them to guide a deeper investigation. He contacted allies in Maryland's small abolitionist community, hired investigators to verify the claims, and built an irrefutable case. In June 1851, the Baltimore American published a series of articles exposing Cross Haven Academy as an experimental breeding facility. The articles included testimony from escaped slaves, documentation of the specialty stock program at Chandler and Sons, and carefully selected excerpts from Cross's correspondence. The story spread to other newspapers, both Northern and Southern. The reaction was explosive. Northern abolitionists cited it as proof of slavery's moral bankruptcy. Southern defenders initially tried to dismiss the story as abolitionist lies, but too many details checked out. Too many sources confirmed the basic facts. The families funding Cross's research scrambled to distance themselves, claimed they'd been deceived about the program's nature, destroyed whatever records they could reach. Maryland's state legislature, embarrassed by the scandal, ordered an investigation. In August, officials raided Cross Haven. They found 41 children still resident, all with the marked eyes. The children were legally confiscated as evidence then, in a rare act of mercy, influenced by abolitionist pressure. Manumitted and placed with free black families willing to take them. Chandler and Sons closed permanently. William and Robert Chandler were charged with fraud and illegal trafficking, though the charges were eventually dropped on technicalities. They left Maryland and disappeared from public record. The specialty stock men, the ones bred with marked eyes, were never found. Grace's network believed they'd been quietly sold south and scattered across Deep South plantations, where their unusual appearance would matter less than their labor value. As for Dr. Hartwell, his involvement remained secret. Only a handful of people knew he'd stolen the documents that made the exposure possible. He returned to his medical practice, continued working quietly with the underground network, and lived another 32 years. In his private journal, discovered after his death in 1883, Hartwell wrote about the marked children often. He estimated that roughly 1/3 of them, maybe 15 or 16, had escaped to freedom through the Underground Railroad before the exposure. The 41 liberated from Cross Haven were given new names, new lives, and most survived into adulthood. But he never learned what happened to the rest, the ones sold south, whose distinctive eyes would have followed them through whatever lives they led under bondage. He wrote, "I have been haunted my entire life by those identical eyes, not because they were unusual in themselves, but because of what they represented. The reduction of human beings to experimental subjects. The treatment of children as data points in a scientific argument. I exposed one program, saved some children, but I know there were others. Other doctors, other experiments, other atrocities we never uncovered. The marked children were only one visible example of an invisible system, and that, more than anything, is what I cannot forget." The Cross Haven scandal faded from public memory within a decade. By the time of the Civil War, it was a footnote in the broader history of slavery's horrors. No comprehensive records were kept of the marked children's fates. No formal accounting was ever made of how many were born, where they ended up, whether the eye trait persisted in their descendants. Some historians have suggested the entire story might be exaggerated or apocryphal, that Crosshaven existed but wasn't quite as sinister as abolitionist newspapers claimed, that the breeding program was smaller and less systematic than documented. But the documents are real. Frederick Douglass's papers include the original letters stolen from the Chesapeake Medical College. The Baltimore American's archives preserve the exposure articles. Maryland legislative records show the investigation and Crosshaven's closure. The babies with identical eyes were real. The program that created them was real. And the fact that we almost lost the entire story to deliberate obscurement is perhaps the most troubling part of all. If Dr. Samuel Hartwell hadn't been the rare physician who valued truth over safety, if Grace's underground network hadn't preserved information that the official record tried to erase, if Thomas hadn't risked his freedom to steal documents, this chapter of history would have remained completely hidden. How many other chapters stayed hidden because no one was positioned to reveal them? How many other experiments, other programs, other systemic abuses disappeared without witnesses willing to speak? That's the question the marked children leave us with. Not just what happened to them specifically, but what we'll never know about. The patterns no one documented, the crimes no one exposed, the victims whose stories died with them. The last confirmed sighting of one of the marked children came in 1889, when a woman named Sarah Freeman, a formerly enslaved person living in Ohio, gave an interview to a local historian. She mentioned that her eldest brother had been born with strange golden eyes, same as a dozen other children we heard about. She said the brother had been sold away when she was young, before the war. She never saw him again, didn't know if he'd survived. But she remembered his eyes, remembered they'd marked him as special in a way she didn't understand until much later, when the stories about Crosshaven surfaced. "I think about him sometimes," Sarah said in that interview. "Wonder if he knew what was done to him before he was born. Wonder if those eyes were a curse or just a mark of someone else's sin. But mostly I hope he got free somehow. Hope he lived long enough to look in a mirror and see himself as a person, not as somebody's experiment. We don't know if he did. We don't know what became of most of the marked children, but we know they existed. We know they were born into a system that treated them as property and data. We know some were saved, many weren't, and all carried a visible reminder of the cruelty humans are capable of when they stop seeing each other as human. That's the truth Marilyn tried to bury. That's the story the doctors who examined those babies almost let disappear. And that's why we tell it now, not because it's comfortable, but because forgetting is worse. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. I know it was heavy. I know it raised questions that don't have easy answers. But that's why this channel exists. To recover the histories that were deliberately obscured, to make sure these voices aren't lost. If you found value in this, if you want more stories that dig into the uncomfortable truths of American history, subscribe and join this community. Leave a comment about what struck you most. Share the video with someone who needs to know this history. And I'll see you in the next story, where we'll continue pulling back the curtain on the things we were never supposed to remember.